Alrighty, let's go ahead and get started. So my name is Andrew Felton. I work with the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District, and tonight I am joined by Laura Price. Hey, Laura,
Hi, everyone.
how are you tonight?
Good. I'm loving this fall weather.
And I saw that rain is heading our way. It's a kind of a crazy thought that it's actually gonna rain tomorrow. But I'm looking forward to it myself. I know my
Yeah, this
plants
is
are as well.
everyone.
Isn't that the truth?
It's going to be 1/10 of an inch and a 50% chance. So I'm trying not to get too excited.
I will take any chance and any amount that's heading our direction. That's
Yeah,
for certain.
I know.
Oh goodness.
Nonetheless, it will still be good for
That's
cleaning the
that's the
air,
truth.
if not anything else. Yeah.
That's the absolute truth.
Yeah.
So tonight's presentation is going to be on naturescaping, site planning, and design. But before we get started, I want to take care of a few housekeeping items. So as many of you heard, we are recording the presentation tonight, and we will be uploading it onto our YouTube channel later this week. I'll also be sending out a follow-up email to everyone who has registered for tonight's presentation. In that email will contain a link to that recording, so don't feel like you have to jot down every last note. You will have a chance to go back and rewatch. As well, within that follow-up email, I'll also include links to any of the resources that we discussed tonight. So any of the items that we talk about, whether that's guides or booklets or programs, you will be receiving a follow-up email with links directly to those. And if there is anything that we do miss, feel free just to respond, and I'm more than happy to provide those resources as well. And if you're watching this recording, all of those resources are just in the description of the YouTube channel just below us here. At the very end of the presentation tonight, you will be prompted to take a survey. If you wouldn't mind just taking a few moments to complete that, it's a big help in helping us develop our workshops and our webinars, and it gives us a chance to see what other topics are out there that folks are interested in. If you do live in Washington County, we do have we are more than happy to send out some printed material, and you can select that in that survey that you're looking at there. Now, just to go over the format tonight, I'm going to provide a brief introduction to soil and water conservation districts. I'll then hand it on over to Laura, at which time we'll talk about the main part of the presentation. And then at the very end, we'll have a chance to ask any questions. And I think also in the middle as well. So if you have any questions tonight, at the very bottom of your screen, you will see an icon that says Q&A. Go ahead and put your questions right into that Q&A box, and I'll read those out to Laura once we get to the break or at the very end. And we'll just read those out on a first come, first serve basis. So feel free to enter those as we go along. I'll be on the other end of the chat, so if you're having any issues, please feel free just to go ahead and message me, and I will troubleshoot as I can. If you wouldn't mind switching the slide, Laura. Now, as I mentioned, I work for the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District. We are one of 45 conservation districts in the state of Oregon. Just about every county in Oregon and across the country has a conservation district. And I encourage you, whether you're in our service area, which is in Washington County, just west of Portland, or anywhere else, to look up your conservation district, because many of them have similar resources that we offer. Now, a conservation district is a non-regulatory agency that helps its residents do conservation actions to protect and conserve our natural resources. Natural resources like soil, water, wildlife habitat, you name it. And we do that in 3 different ways. We do that through technical assistance. So we have experts that come out and actually provide site visits and can give you direct advice about any natural resource issue that you might be having. We also do that through financial assistance. We actually pay for many of these conservation actions to happen on your properties. If you're more interested in that, please feel free to follow up with me after the presentation. And we also do that through education programs like the one that you're joining us tonight. Next slide. Now, how does naturescaping fit into that? That's a really great question. Naturescaping is all about planting native plants, and native plants are essential to keep watersheds healthy. We like to say we work on a watershed level. Now, native plants are adapted to the climate that they're from, so they have deeper roots that help hold onto the soil so we don't have erosion. Native plants also soak up more water so that it can help reduce flooding as well as runoff, so that not as much pollution will make it into our rivers, creeks, and streams. Not to mention, native plants are essential for wildlife. They provide the best wildlife habitat around. Wildlife and native plants have been co-evolving with one another for millennia, so they have a specific niche that they provide for wildlife. And finally, native plants don't typically need pesticides or fertilizers that can often turn into runoff and pollution into our rivers, creeks, and streams. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Laura for tonight's presentation.
All right, thank you. So as our title said, this is a workshop that focuses on site planning. I trust that most of you have had the introduction or basics to naturescaping and the goals and principles of that. So the purpose of tonight's workshop is to take that knowledge and then provide you with the tools and a process that will help you plan, visualize, and create a garden design that achieves all your outdoor living and naturescaping goals. I know it's not to say that there's beautiful gardens out there that kind of evolved over time, just piece by piece, and that's okay. But oftentimes it really helps it can be overwhelming, especially if you bought a new house and you've got maybe a sort of a blank slate, or just even a big yard where you don't know where to begin. So why do I advocate making a plan? I believe that if you have a scaled plan or base map, if you will, of your property with house and major features, it helps you organize all of the spaces and the activities that you want in your garden or in your outdoors in a way that makes sense and is cohesive. And you'll see why as we get into this. It helps you locate the things you want, like a patio or a kitchen garden or a woodland garden, where it would best fit on your site and your site conditions. And so as you might guess, we start with a process that is a site assessment. And by having an overall vision or game plan, it helps you prioritize and phase. Not everybody can hire it all out, and you're a do-it-yourselfer, and it kind of gives you a way to figure out, okay, I'm going to focus here this year, and the next year we'll get to that. But you know that you have a place, in your mind or on your plan for everything that you would like to include in your yard. And last but not least, once you have this to scale where you can measure off square footage and such like that, you can start to figure out more accurately materials, like say for gravel walkway, how much to get in cubic yards. There's math for that. Or how many plants will really fit into a place, if you're basing it on their full size. And so hopefully those reasons all resonate with you. And this is a little bit of a review of the first naturescaping basics, and Andrew hit on a lot of the points already in the intro. But it's a practice of creating, and I want to stress also caring for your landscape, so that it includes native plants, provides for wildlife habitat, protects and builds healthy living soils. I know that's just a phrase, but as my experience grows, my respect for healthy living soil it's so much essential to an organic and natural way of gardening that I include that in here. And naturescaping conserves water use, which is increasingly important with our climate change. And part of that means also optimizing the stormwater or rainfall that we get on our site. And yes, it avoids chemical pollutants, and it is not a sacrifice to give that up. I can wholeheartedly say that by gardening organically, you have a full kind of ecosystem where the microbes in the soil are feeding the plants and helping them be resilient, and the organic matter in the soil helps absorb stormwater. It's just they all relate in beneficial ways, and all of this should ideally be reducing cost and maintenance for you. So it can be a win-win-win. And this is reviewing, but just again, why native plants? Doesn't mean you have to be 100% native plants, but definitely move. It's nice to be able to look at your yard and say, wow, 50% of these are natives. And because and it makes it more low maintenance for you, because these guys are adapted to our soils. Of course they are. They were here before anybody else was here. And so if it's a heavy clay soil or where you find them in different situations, they're used to that. And more importantly is our climate, that we have very wet for many months of the year. And then we have these, hopefully we're at the end of it, 100 days of no rain. And so plants have to be able to withstand those kind of 2-season extremes. And they are less susceptible to common garden pests and diseases. And they, as Andrew said, they are more attractive to bees and butterflies and birds that have co-evolved with them, and they recognize them in a lot of cases more so than the flashier kind of ornamental hybrids of these natives. We touched on the low maintenance. So when I think about design principles, this is a really quick summary, and we'll get into all of this, but it, we already mentioned that you incorporate native plants as much as possible. And it's about understanding the microclimate, where you see those plants in nature, and you're going to try to use that knowledge to make sure you have kind of right plant, right place, or, plant in the best place in your yard, whether it's sun loving or shady, shade tolerant, or wants more moisture. So that's really important. Vegetative layering, you're kind of seeing a good case of that right here in this photo. You have a ground cover layer and then kind of an herbaceous perennials. We see some sword ferns, kind of in bushes at waist high level. Then you get into some larger shrubs and understory trees, and then finally, overstory trees like our big native conifers that are going to be 150, 200 feet tall. Another thing to keep in mind is year-round features. The features are both for wildlife and for you to enjoy. So with our flowers or perennials and shrubs, etc., trying to choose species where you can have blooms as much of the year as possible, and a real long season of berries is really helpful. But you also want evergreens for that winter shelter and appeal through the year, and some pop of fall color is always nice too. So we water conservation, as I mentioned before, and it's not just lowering the use of the water that you apply, but amending your soil so that it holds more water within it, like a squeezed out sponge, longer, so they can withstand, plants can withstand our hot, dry segments. So that's why we touch on the soil building and protection, using the rainwater, and also plant so that you can maximize energy conservation of your home. And that means like providing shade on south and west sides in the summer, or perhaps a windbreak on a north or east side to stop some winds. So let's say you're ready to get started. Some of you may actually even have a plat map if you have a newer home. That is a good start. If not, you could look up your property on GIS maps online. And I use several of these because mostly Portland maps and Metro maps because of where I am. And this that you're seeing here on this slide is from Portland maps. So you can see that, here's a place where you enter the address and it comes up on a map. And you can, of course, you can see several little titles that you can click on. And this one that I happen to be showing you here that gets down to, if you go to assessor and then go down to assessor details, which is at the bottom of assessor, it actually shows you the boundaries of your property in feet. Here it's a little hard to see on this screen, but they are there. And so that gives you some links to start with. And it's also helpful if you have an irregular shaped property to see that. You can also see there's sort of a footprint of the major, the home and garage that's in there. If you want to just sort of softly sort of pencil that in and then confirm it on the ground. If you're on, if your home property has some slope to it, this is a really cool feature in Metro Maps over here. You can, in both cases, you can either, just see a street map or the regular base map that is an aerial photo, but you also have the choice to click on aerial photo. And you can see that up here, if you can follow my cursor, in the upper right corner of the Metro map. So I have put it on photos, aerial photo, and then I have, you can go to a menu in the Metro map that where you can select contours, and they will show those. And here you can see they're every 2 feet. There's a heavy one, so the heavy ones are every 10 feet, and then 2, 4, 6, 8, and another 10 is coming down here. And we'll talk about slope, but you can get, it's really pretty good at getting a sense of, how steep your slope is. In fact, they even have a feature for slopes over 10% or slopes over 25%. And so you can see how much of your property might be over 25% slope. So this is some good information to start with, and it can help you lay down on your piece of paper the basic, to scale. And I like to use a 1/4 inch. It's just equals 1 foot. It's a nice scale to work at that helps you draw the detail and the plants in as you get into design. Let's see. So let's talk about how we measure, then supplement or add on to these basic measurements on the ground. So if you don't already have it, it's not a major investment. I really like this 100-foot landscape tape measure. Really easy to roll out. It's waterproof, of course. And you'll want a 25-foot tape as well. And then you'll want some grid paper to work on. It just makes it easy, since easier to work. It's not critical when you're getting your measurements, but it's helpful. And so it might become a big sheet of paper once you get your whole lot. If it's 150 by or 50 by 100, it'd be on a smaller piece of paper. So I realize that's not something everybody goes out and buys every day, but if you go to any of the art stores or in Portland, there's Columbia Art supplies and drafting supplies, and there's others as well. Blick, which is a national chain. Yeah, and a sheet of paper might cost you $2 or $3. It's also, you want a ruler. Any ruler can work, but if you have it, it's nice to have an architect's ruler that breaks things down into 1/8 inch scale or 1/4 inch scale, and it's just easier. But really, any ruler, 12-inch ruler, is helpful. Of course, pencil and eraser, because what you're doing is you're laying down the remaining features and plants to kind of establish your base map that you're going to be working from. And there is if you do want to measure some slopes, and it becomes kind of key in areas like maybe you have a slope down from your deck and you need steps, or it just helps to see how much drop you have over a length of run. And I'll show you that too. It's a string line and a line level that you will use. Okay, so for measuring, these are the two. There is a triangulation method that I'm not getting into, just because I find that I don't really need it. There's other ways to kind of place a tree that seems to be floating in the middle of a yard. But running measurement method is what you'll be using the most. And I'm showing you this example up front or up on top here. You can see this is the front of the house here. Little stoop for the front door. Okay. This is the driveway over here, and another driveway on the other side with retaining wall there. And we say that it's, I think it's four feet high, 1 foot wide. Yeah. And sidewalk goes up with their steps there too. So really what we're capturing, so this is what we call a baseline, now where you lay down the tape. And then you measure off from this baseline, like the house starts at, driveway's at 0, the house starts at 1 foot. This tree is at 3 feet. And then you'll be picking up windows and any jogs or bends in the house. And it's not every little plant, but major, woody shrubs, as you can see. Some of these is 6.5 feet wide, 4 feet wide, 6 feet wide. So I'm locating both the kind of the circumference of the bush, but also the main trunk in these cases. And the reason you do running is it cuts out the inaccuracies. If you're taking your tape and going, oh, it's 2 feet, and then it's another 3 feet to here, and then there's just a lot of room for a little bit of slop or inaccuracy to get built in. So we use a running method, and that tape could go in both directions, or you can move it, as you see fit to easily pick up, pick up everything. Like, maybe it really just wants, well, I went by the shrubs. I put it as close to the house as I could that I thought made sense there. So offset measurement method, which you see an example down below, is notice there was existing lawn. This is all existing conditions. And then there were these beds, and it's like, well, we may keep them that way, or we may change. You may want to change things and get rid of lawn altogether. And then it's not so important to have this in your base map. But let's say there was a curving walkway that was a fixed element, and you wanted to get that accurately. So again, we're using a baseline down in the bottom near the walkway. And we can just use this example here again, the yellow baseline. If we had come down at various equal points, you can see down here, I decided to do it every 4 feet. It all depends on how tight or loose that curve is. And then plot those dots. And then it's just connecting the dots and getting those curves in there. So it's really great to capture a fixed existing feature. But it's also great. Let's say you wanted to design your beds with a certain undulating flow. This is another way where you can then use the offset method to transfer from the piece of paper out to your landscape to actually create what you have on paper on the ground. So as I alluded to, you want to capture all the existing conditions that will matter to you to consider. And some won't. Like if you know a tree's coming out, you don't need to necessarily put that in your existing conditions, unless you're leaving the stump, of course. So here's an example, and really this would all be done on grid paper. You won't see it in this fancy graphics, but this is just to show you the kind of fixed existing conditions that you want to pay attention to. So we have the footprint of the house, but we also have, as you can see, windows and doors, entry. We're just looking at where are the downspouts coming down. That's pretty key. Also some faucets or maybe a dryer vent. You need access to faucets, so that's important to note. And then of course the hardscape features of the steps down in the back and in the front, up to the sidewalk. In this specific example, the driveway was in really poor shape. And the client, or the people that own this house, they really wanted to remove the driveway and just have a short driveway for a one-car family and gain more room to establish plants. So let's see what else. There's a retaining wall at the street that they captured and noted that it's 3 feet height. They're identifying some invasive ivy in the front, so they know that will need to get rid of. They also noted kind of a worn path between driveway and front step. So, even though this might seem like a, what shall I say? I don't want to say tedious, but yeah, it is a methodical exercise, but the value of it that I see is that it really gets your eyes seeing and noticing in a way that you probably don't normally do in your backyard. And it also, in that process of recording or noting all of these things, it gets you thinking about possibilities as well. So it's really a useful exercise. Okay, so we're continuing on here on those boundaries. They're also noting whether it's a chain link fence or a wood fence and how high. Speaking of how high, I sort of missed this, but on the windows, you don't not only want to know where they are, but how high they are from the ground. So that's going to inform you quite a lot when you get to planting plan as to how high or low they need to be. So they did include a garage and a carport. And there wasn't a lot going on in this example of a home. It was pretty much just lawn in the background or backyard. But so we don't see anything that truly was a blank canvas. And we also have noted some overhead lines that will certainly come into figuring if you want to look at where to place your trees or where not. And it's good to know where your underground utility lines are running too, but they tend to be not in all situations, but they tend to be pretty close to the driveway. So if you have existing planting beds that you want to keep, show those, and any plants that you might that you want to keep within those. You want to document those, as you see here. There is one nice, I think that was a dogwood tree right there that's noted. So I think that's it. It's hard surfaces and main vegetation, planting beds, and any other fixed features that you want to note. Also in here, they've just sort of noted, because it seems to come into play, neighbors on this, there's shrubs on this side that are already doing some screening. So that's good to note. In other areas where there isn't, you may want to create screening. And then on this side, they're showing them small, but I'm sure that there probably are branches hanging over from those neighbors' trees. And in this case, they're birch with aphids, which tend to drip sap in the summertime. So, that informs you right away that it's like, well, if I want a dining area, it's not going to be here. So as I say, you're not only seeing things that you might not normally see or think about. It starts to become an assessment of the site, of your existing conditions. So all of the notes that you've kind of drawn up on paper can be transferred then to a base map, either by hand, as in this case. There's that same lot that we just looked at, you can tell. And or you can use any number of landscape design software programs. There's a lot of them out there that aren't professional level, just sort of garden homeowner level. And these are just a few of them here. Smart Draw, Dynascape, graph paper. SketchUp goes a little three-dimensionally. You probably don't necessarily need that one. Garden Visualizer, Plan a Garden. So if you're more comfortable with working digitally, check those out. And you can see in these cases, the scale, as I mentioned before, is a 1/4 inch equals 1 foot. Or another way you could say it is 1 inch equals 4 feet. So 1/2 inch, is 2 foot shrub. 1 inch is a 4 foot shrub. So you just start thinking in those terms. So I mentioned, assessing your site. And here's a little bit about the soil. And a good time to see what's happening is also if it rains. Do you have any, erosion problems or puddling close to the house? Those are some things to, surely notice and address in your design. And if you've done any work, you probably know, basically what kind of soil you have. Most of us have a pretty heavy clay soil. And of course, the remedy for that is just to work in some really nice compost with that soil in the, top 4 inches or 6 inches at least. And is there a healthy structure with it? Like you've all seen, especially in our urban areas, soil that's so compacted, it's almost like concrete, and it's not a great place for plants to thrive. So that structure, as I mentioned, is improved by adding organic matter. And, this consistency where it's crumbly is ideal for plants. In looking at this little diagram up here, you can see that a good growing medium soil is really only about 45-50% soil minerals. And then it has 5% organic matter. I mean, when we add it in, we're adding more like 1-to-2 proportion, 2 parts, 1 part organic matter to 2 parts soil, but it works out to that. And then look at this, almost 50% of that soil volume is air space and water space. So you get good drainage, and most importantly, it's really, you have a thriving microbial life in the soil with that soil makeup. They need the air, and they need, and you need water to drain easily down to develop deep roots and all of that. You can do soil testing. There are labs out there, and I won't get into the detail here. But if you look them up. I think one is A&L Labs. In my experience, especially when I was on the board for community gardens, we always tested soil for toxins. pH is something that's likely to change, as is, the macronutrients of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and those are ones you can add. And so if you're really an avid grower or a farmer, you do want to optimize those nutrients, and the soil test will tell you just, what would be good to add. And maybe some things you already have in the soil, like magnesium, and you don't want to add lime that has magnesium attached to it. So as I say, but it's mostly I think getting the structure condition of the soil that is important for natives, because as we said, they're used to our native soils. So we talked about that compaction, but overall, you want to know how well the water drains in your soil, it percolates. And this little example on the bottom left is testing for that. Like if you're interested in doing a rain garden, particularly, you want to make sure that that rain garden is going to drain, because that's the whole purpose of it. So here we have someone has dug a hole a foot deep, and they filled it with water and let that drain, and then filled it again. And the reason you do that is that this looks like this test was done in summer, and you're trying to simulate winter conditions, which is when we get our rains, and the soils as winter wears on, may be fairly saturated. So how quickly or slowly does that water drain in the winter time? So here, let's assume we've let it drain a few times, and now we're filling it up, and they have a tape measure here. You might just put a stake down with a little marking, a little line where the water level is at the start. And then you come back after an hour and see how much it's dropped. And if it's dropped a ½ inch, that's actually sufficient drainage for a rain garden. So you saw this picture of the contours and slopes, and we can see it here again, a little zoomed out. And here's where I've clicked on in this menu over here, I've clicked on to show where steeper slopes were. We see slopes over 10%, and we can see how much of the area has that. So it's kind of neat to see the lay of your land. Like if you understand how contours work, I can see a couple drainages coming here and here, turn around, and usually you'll see, in cases like this, sometimes these contours, well, they're done by, flyover LiDAR, and if there's been some grading work, it doesn't pick up every little developed grading change, but it is a initial level that is helpful to see. And you kind of know that which way the water is flowing on your site, where the high point is right here, and the low point is probably going to be, actually it kind of fans out because this is pretty equal here down there. And here's a little step-by-step to measure that slope. And we do it in our, I teach another class where we get down into detail on how to build a rain garden. And this is one of the assessing things that we do. So, we see a house with a downspout, and we know we want a rain garden about in this area, and we want to make sure that the slope is right. We don't want too steep a slope. It just complicates the process of building a rain garden. But so here's a stake, and its string is tied to it at one end, and you can see that string is right at the ground level. And then, and this is a pretty even slope. If the slope changed, dramatically kind of midway, then you'd really be measuring two slopes. But this is pretty consistent. And then a stake is put in at this distance away that we figured we'd want our rain garden in, as an example. And this little jobby here is called a line level. You can see it, or string level. And it's just this tiny little thing over here with a bubble in it. And you're just kind of, it helps to have two people. So one can be moving the string up and down to find the level while another person is reading the level. And once you find that, you pull that string really taut and tight and measure this vertical and this horizontal distance. And then it's just a math problem. You can do in your phone. You're dividing 18 inches. In this case, we've converted I think it was 9 feet something, and we've converted into all inches so we can do the math. And that gives you 0.07, or times 100, it gives you, you have a 7.7% slope, which is really great. In this case, we advocate for rain gardens to be on slopes that are 10% or less. So that's right in there. And here you can see this person doing it with a board and a bar, for a little slope anyway. You can also, I did this just with my phone, where I wanted to measure a slope, and I rested it on the top of the fence that was matching the slope. So I got it in degrees, but you can change that into percents. And then there's these fancy tools out there that are really nice, that can help you see slope as well. So in addition to figuring out slopes, you want to see what else is going on with the soil, as I mentioned. This case, we can see there's maybe even runoff coming from the street. It's like, wow, you'd want to stop that if that's happening. You don't need to be receiving storm runoff from beyond your site. And, and we can start to see, maybe there's rivulets forming downhill, which means you've got some pretty active erosion going on. In this case, it's like, well, the grades aren't right. The water doesn't have a chance to actually flow away from the foundation as it comes down the downspout. So that is certainly something to correct. And on this bottom one, we can see, erosion happening as well. That's kind of steep to be holding, and you wouldn't want it to be eroding from under your, this concrete pad. So notice these things, and it's nice to go out in a rainfall and see, where is the water running? Where is it running from across your driveway? Where is it accumulating? And, and notice if there's anything that you might want to correct with respect to drainage. The other next fairly important thing to assess, and I've done this especially when I was looking to place my vegetable raised bed boxes, because they want at least 6 hours of full sun a day. So we have full sun and we have deep shade, but in between there's a deep shade woodland garden. And by the way, there's lots of native ground cover plants that would love a shady garden. Here we have dappled light, so it's kind of half light, half shady. And then we'll have cases where it's like, oh, this gets morning sun, but not afternoon, or vice versa. So all of this is important information, and I know it changes between May and October. And so if you're going out and noting it, say on a June day, that is the longest day, that's going to, or say summer solstice, that's where you're going to get your most sun. But maybe you want to check it out in April, or now September, as the kind of the path of the sun is certainly getting lower in the sky. And there are apps for this as well. I have to admit, I haven't used them, but I've worked on projects where we have Sunseeker, Sun Surveyor, Find My Shadow, all phone applications. There are even tools to know, well, how high is a tree? As you measure and look at it. And from there, you can calculate summer and fall, the shade that it will cast. Here we're seeing the difference between summer and winter as well. So how much is in shade. So that's fairly important. So soils, grades, sun, views, and breezes are also important to note. Maybe there's some views you want to screen, and maybe there's some other views like to the mountain, possibly, or something else that you want to really frame and keep, keep as part of your borrowed landscape, is a phrase we use. So yeah, this client had, they were right next to a golf course. So it was really a big part of their enjoyment of being out in their yard. But they also had kind of tucked in this little cafe table behind some larger shrubs and plants where they could feel a little more coziness or privacy. Oops, that was an accident. And then in this photos to the right, we see what a difference it can make, to provide some screening where you may not have any. Like this is a fine backyard to somebody's house. But, if you really want to make a place that is yours, where you feel like it's, somewhat of a outdoor room, what a difference this, having a hedge here makes in terms of an inviting place to sit and enjoy the yard or watch the birds or what have you. And it's helpful to be outside with your camera and just to notice things, visualizing. Not everybody can read or work with a plan or see things three-dimensionally when you're working with a two-dimensional drawing. So you can also take photographs and start to imagine where you want to fill in and what you might want to block or how high it needs to be. In this case, they're, also envisioning a rain garden, farther away from the house than here, I might add, but nonetheless, this is something you can use your camera to help visualize. And it's also good to just notice details. I do this all the time when I'm not at the site, and it's like, how did that exactly go? I have a lot of photographs to refer to. And then this could be a really big one, or maybe not much at all. But as you think about the vegetation that's in your yard, first and foremost, do you have invasive plants? And if so, they should be removed. I noticed a few of you were in the backyard habitat program, and if a technician comes out, they're probably doing that first step for you, identifying what and where you have invasive plants. And then there's kind of an assessment of those plants. Are there, which ones do you really love? And you may even want to design around, if you happen to have a magnificent tree in the yard like this, what's happening beneath it? Have you noticed which vegetation supports the bird habitat and or pollinators? Do they have berries on them or blooms? And how are your neighbors' trees affecting your light and your views? Or are they dropping, a million little seedlings, say from a Norway maple that you have to contend with? It's just helpful to know, because these all have impacts on your yard. If there are diseased or damaged plants, my motto is to not be fussing, especially if that means chemicals. Just if they're really damaged from years of abusive pruning, or we do have invasive insects that are coming in, especially on our rhodies and azaleas. And my thought is just to get rid of them. And if that's the case, of course, it all depends, as to where they're at. You make that evaluation. And also it's good to note, like, of what you have there. Is it is there a nice balance of evergreen and deciduous, or is it all deciduous? And you really want to be thinking about and focusing on bringing some year-round greenery into your yard. A few more questions or things to note. Maybe it's a fine plant, but it's just really in the wrong place. It's like a tree that's over a roof and it drops a lot of leaves and needles and it affects the life of the roof. That would be a case to consider. In this case, it's a pretty small house, and I don't know what, I'm looking at the top picture here with this pink house. Their picture window is totally blocked by this evergreen, probably arborvitae shrub. And or maybe a tree would benefit from just a little bit of limbing to kind of be more inviting of the house. So, look at that. And some of these plants that are overgrown, you really can prune them and regenerate them, cut them back and get it, especially if they're not healthy. I don't know, that's popping up. You already said about removing unhealthy plants. But here's one where it's like, yes, it's very mature, it grows down to the ground and you really can't, it just becomes a big mountain or lump. But with nice selective pruning, you're lifting it up a bit and you're opening up and you really get to enjoy the architecture structure of the branching, which is half the appeal of these Japanese maples. So the other thing I'm finding is that a lot of plants that may be in the yard, they might be from the 40s or something. And, we don't have the same climate and they're just not thriving anymore. And we're moving more drought tolerant to more drought tolerant plants. So that's something you may want to consider as well. So we've kind of run through all of these features or attributes that you want to notice and assess or analyze. And you can even have, now that you made a base map, you could have a little trace paper over it, or you could have a couple copies, and you can start to make a compilation of that assessment. You can see jotting here, it's like they're starting to do the very beginning of the design too, that they want more privacy here, want a quiet area here. The slope is eroding. We need a treatment for that. There's an eyesore over here that they want to screen. This is where the sun hits their veggie beds, and you start to see how is this all going to fit. But you see, importantly, that the things that you want to create are tied to where it makes the most sense on the site. And maybe you inherently just know this, but it's kind of good to go through this exercise and kind of capture all the things that you want to accomplish in your design. And here is back to that other one we saw where we overlaid the sunshade patterns, the drainage patterns, which in this case, note a problem. In fact, this house was a sort of musty in the basement and they wanted to correct that. The views, both far views and close-up views, like the far views could be something that, like the mountain far away, that you want to keep that view open. So you get the idea here, where the winter winds are coming from, also important. So you compile that site assessment. Here's just two more examples here that we did, both a small site and a large site. And it's showing intent, to have less lawn, wanting a little water feature, really didn't want their whole backyard to be a wall of arborvitae. Could we diversify that with a few more trees that would offer some flowers and berries. I've identified where a rain garden would fit, some invasive weeds to remove, where, some areas for vegetable or berry garden, where they could do screening and also create a habitat hedgerow. So the design is developing, but it's still not, it's not finally delineated. It's really schematic or conceptual. Going, yes, we need to connect the front yard to the backyard with walking. Here they're identifying all the invasive plants there, and a lawn area that's very soggy, things to address in the design. So I don't know if I went too fast or not, but I see there's a question or two. So
we
we'll
do have a couple questions. So let me start with the first one that got asked in the Q&A. So this is talking about amending compacted soil. So how would you recommend amending compacted soil? They're thinking about at a construction site or places that have had recent evacuation or excavation work. And when would be the best time to do that amending?
Well, fall, after we've had a few rains, is a great season for doing your landscape projects because the soil has moisture in it. It's really nice digging when it has some moisture in it, as opposed to hard as a rock. And you also want to avoid it when it's too saturated with water. If you try digging, it gets kind of sloppy and muddy, and all of your feet on the ground actually compacts it and negatively impacts the structure, the nice structure of the soil that we want with the air spaces and all. So fall season or spring season, and it really, like, if there's been a week of consistent rain, let it drain in for a few days, and then it's good to get into. I did a project in the heat of this summer, and it was a small one, a little postage stamp, but I said, I told my client to just, put some water on the soil for, a couple hours, let it, the day before. And it was just night and day difference. She goes, oh, I see. This is really nice to dig now. So, if it's not a large area or you're just kind of doing a bed at a time, you can do that as well, I guess. And, but you want to, if it's just soil, if it's, grass on top or weeds on top, you want to remove that before you're digging that surface layer. So, and we're going to talk about sheet mulching as another method to remove lawn, but hand pulling can get kind of tedious with, say, certain weeds and or shrubs. So it really depends on your site, what it is you're doing and what that starting condition is. But I hope that helps.
Yeah, I know. Just another reason to be waiting for the rain to come our way, right?
That's right.
We did have one other question that is kind of in this assessment phase from the registration. They signed up within the last couple of days, so I don't think you've seen this question. So I'm catching you a little off guard with it, but I think it fits really nicely. So they live in a house that was built in the 1950s. And so they have a lot of existing foundational plants. Almost all of them are non-native, but they're trying to augment it by adding native plants. So what would you, kind of thinking about what plants they want to take out, what guidance would you offer in deciding which healthy non-native plants that they should take out of their yard? They're not talking about anything that's invasive, but rather just, what's kind of a good decision tree that you'd think about when you're trying to decide if you want to, if a non-native plant contributes to their garden.
Mm-hmm. Wait, you're saying the non-natives are existing?
Yes.
And they want to take how they should consider removing some to work in some native plants.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
What would you kind of think about as you're assessing the
Well,
site on which
when I
ones?
think of the 50s in Portland, I think of hybrid tea roses, rhodies, azaleas, and conifers like juniper, which
Mhm.
is pretty stinky, and I wouldn't want that close to the house. So, and a lot of our rhodies, if they're in the sun, they get affected the worst by this lace bug that's very invasive in our area right now. So I would consider removing azaleas and rhodies. I hate to say that as a blanket assessment or a blanket recommendation, if they look healthy. But I've just done work at a house where it's like, oh God, it's been hack pruned for 50 years. And it wants to be, because it wants to be, 15 feet tall, but they're trying to keep it below a window. So, that's a question of a wrong plant in the wrong place. And it's tortured. It's never going to get a nice form back. So that I would be looking at that as well. And then the other thing is, gosh, what are the eaves of your house, and how, maybe they're just all too close to the foundation. If you're watering them, is water causing damage to the foundation? So you might, want to be taking them out and putting something else in that has a little more distance from the foundation. So there's all those reasons around the house. And if you have, deep eaves, you have to understand they're not getting much water under those eaves. So that's another reason to kind of be setting them 2 feet, at least 2 feet away from the foundation. If you think the average eaves are about 2 feet, but maybe not. Maybe like 1930s, 40s, I think they don't have much depth of eaves in those houses. So those are all things to consider, and I won't even begin to talk about what plants to put in, because it just gets really specific to exposure and what you want, and et cetera, et cetera.
Well, and luckily we end with a nice bit of inspiration in our last section here. So there might be some plants in there that might fit some of those exposure types or conditions that person is looking at.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to continue straight through, right?
Yeah, I think we probably should, since we're running a little short on time.
Okay.
But thanks for those great questions so far.
7. Okay.
No rush though.
Yeah. All righty. Oops. There we go. Okay, so you've already thought about things, but I actually make a list of, and it adds up, of your garden goals and desires. So your site, and what, you're trying to accommodate in the whole yard. And this is just an example list. And I can almost look at that and say, I want all of these, and you may have something unique and completely different that you want, but it's just nice to sort of take note and have your wish list, so to speak. And some of those other things we talked about, like where you might frame a view, or that large shade tree. Do you want to create a sitting place under it? What do you want to do with that precious sunny spot, and what problems do you need to solve? And I add these at the bottom. They're more like aesthetic choices. I just know I've had many clients that they've learned enough to, it's sort of like a candy store. They want to, I applaud their goal. They want to go naturescaping, but when it comes down to it, it's like, well, I really don't spend time in the garden, and I don't like things to be touching. I don't want it messy, So, I look at these two and, is that too messy for you or is that lovely for you? It's definitely showing the layers and plants intertwine. And similarly here, that's where like paths and other hard elements give you that structure. But then, within the garden beds, there can be a much softer interplay of plants. And you can go a little farther and think your favorite seasons or colors and or styles. If you have a mid-century home, maybe you want more architectural plants to go with that. Or if it's a bungalow, arts and crafts home, there were periods really did have different gardening styles and practices. So just keep that in mind when you're thinking about your design. So what you see here, I call a concept design, or we in the trade refer to bubble diagramming because it's still kept loose, but it's starting to put everything in place. And you can kind of see this with areas and also walkways. So all the elements of that wish list are here. And similarly in this one too, you can see the privacy screens, outdoor living, meaning, this is maybe where your patio or deck is happening. A cut garden, that's a unique feature that, how do you want your home to look from the street? Is it inviting? Here we can see they've identified a spot where they can take some of the water and infiltrate it into the ground. So these bubble diagrams, then now you're ready to move to, this is another one that's just an example of showing you how you might do it with the, the digital programs, apps. Yeah. And then you get into the actual, delineating the actual shape of like, well, how does that path, what's the exact curve, or does that, is a straight jogging type of path or a curving path? How big should that patio be to accommodate whatever dining table or furniture you might have? How much room can you really, allow for your garden beds? And we can see, hedge widths of, this is probably 5 feet here. And so this is where it really gets specific, your design, and you're starting to identify the major shrubs and trees and then shrub beds of where your smaller plants will fill in beneath that. And similarly here, like you see all the major trees and shrubs, but beneath that, there will probably be some ground covers that will fill in and those areas. So, but it does start to get to scale. So it's like, well, if like we see here, this was the slope that was eroding a bit, and they want some evergreen low shrubs that will hold that slope. And it looks like, they're already sized in this case, so you know how many you will need. But it's not a complete planting plan. And that's, and this is again, those other two properties that I showed you that we assessed, getting into more specifically delineated paths and patios and plants scaled out to see how many plants will really take, the exact shape of the lawn, the lines of the path, etc. But then you get into, with all of that, more detail if you're going to be doing planting right, to really fill in all those planting beds. So I have some planting design guidelines that I want to relay here. So that right plant, right place, which we've said from the beginning. Plants, when you go out in nature, you see plant communities together oftentimes, and that's because they like the same conditions. So they're, they're neighbors. And so adopt that. If you want to create a woodland garden under a big fir tree, you're going to see those plants that like that condition. And we say cluster them so that you're not just one of everything. You're seeing more massing or drifts, which is actually more interesting aesthetically to the eye to see those larger forms rather than like a confetti, look of a lot of busyness. And it's also valuable ecologically, because for the birds and or bees that are trying to find their sources, you've got more of a buffet to offer them, and they can find them easier. When they get there, they have a lot more to be eating by having more clusters or swaths of plants. And, pay attention to those layers, like we mentioned in the beginning. And I love this little diagram here that shows the species of birds and what kind of horizon level or vertical level they like to occupy in the trees and shrubs and ground. So you're actually diversifying your habitat vertically there as well. So I talk about massing swaths or drifts of plants, making sure you have some both evergreen and deciduous here. And if you don't want to be in the garden all the time, I have this great book called The Sustainable Northwest Landscapes, and the author points to sustaining the gardener over the years. And I certainly, that certainly resonates with me right now. So, avoid a lot of busy flowers and perennials that tend to be more high maintenance, and stick with trees, shrubs, and those blanketing ground covers. Really can create a low maintenance landscape for you. And then, as we mentioned again, think about if there's some opportunities, conserve energy in your home. You might want some shade over your driveway or over the air conditioner so it doesn't have to work as hard. And we talked about windbreaks as well. And I, as a landscape architect, I think of a plant's structural form or its function. There's certainly all of the aesthetic features of texture and color and lightness and darkness and large and small texture and all of that to play with. But structurally, you're using them. These are the tools. Like an architect has walls and roofs and windows and doorways. Well, we use plants to screen or provide shade or enclose, kind of create a room, a sitting space, or a campfire circle, what have you. And we can also find plants that we can walk on, or just to cover ground, so you don't have it keeps the weeds from growing in, and it creates a cooler microclimate to have more plants in your yard. It's not as scorched. You might need plants to stabilize a slope, to invite the wildlife, to soften hardscape. Like if you have retaining walls or rock walls, there are plants that can sort of trail and spill over those. Or maybe you want it to, got miles and miles of wood fence. Maybe you want something that will climb the fence, or you can have it, in this case, this is a trellis of a star jasmine, that creates a nice green wall there. And down below, I just put this in, I saw this at the treatment plant in Milwaukee. Some really solid screening, and it's all natives. There's Pacific wax myrtle. Here, I don't know if you can see, this is the lower left. Pacific wax myrtle here. And there is a strawberry tree here. I think they had a silk tassel tree, and they had a tall Oregon grape also. And they were all like, here's a case where they have sheared them to create a hedge. But it was enlightening to me to see that they did that successfully, and it worked. So you could even use native plants to make a hedge. So now we're getting down to the detail. We'll just look at this one here. This is just to show the different styles of visually, if it helps you to see, you know, the different types of plants with a different drawing, you can go that method. Or in this case, you know, it's mostly circles, ferns, you know, they've come kind of blended that technique. So like here, this shows that it's evergreen there. And yeah, Marhonia, no, what are those? Yeah, Calicedrus decurrens. So that's cedar tree. But you can see also that they're sort of flagged out with the names of them. So they're actually counting for, you know, plant by plant, just what you're going to plant. And then they're labeled out here in these flag lines. Here's another case where you can see they're using, you know, sort of different different ways to show a plant, so you can kind of visually see the planting plan, how it might look. And notice that in this case, with the larger trees that are deciduous, or just larger trees, period, not just deciduous, because we have a shore pine here and ammonia. But you see through them because you wanna be able to see what you're planting underneath. And then for the areas that are ground cover, you know, you're not bothering to show individual plants, but just the areas that will be filled in with ground cover. But again, you can see how they're clustering them in groupings here to get those swaths of distinctive textures and colors. So as I said, there are plant communities, or companions is another way to think about it. So these are some of our shady plants, and they are mixed in with non-natives. Like the bottom right, we see hosta, very familiar to a lot of folks. This is a maidenhair fern, which is native, and a ground cover. Oh gosh, that one escapes me at the moment, but you know, it's this one is a non-native as well. But we can see under in the top left, you know, it's under a large fir, and we have various shrubs. I think in the back there's even a vine maple. So there's an understory tree. This looks like a huckleberry, and maybe a water leaf or some redwood sorrel, ground covers. And you can even see this one, how it goes from shade to a little more light. And in the light, you get the plants that are going to be flowering and wanting more sunlight. So that's the general rule too, is that, you know, if you want, there's a lot of our natives that are really adaptable to both shade and light, but there's sort of a sweet spot for them. Probably like the vine maple, they tend to grow at the edge of the forest. So they're benefiting from some shade, but they're also getting sunlight, you know, for those, to feed all those leaves. And otherwise they'd be sprawling. If they have too much shade, they're sprawling to try to find the light. And it's a very sparse tree form. So for flowering shrubs where you want the blooms and you want the flowers, you're going to lean more toward the sunny end of their the spectrum of where they can do fine, but you want more fruit and flower from them. And here is just for your eyes a whole lovely assortment of our shade loving ground covers, and you may recognize many of these. And here we see switch to more sunny. I should have had Kinnikinnick in here, but we see some large flowering shrubs. Again, they're blooming as nicely as they are because of the sun. And over here we see more perennials that love the sun. We have the columbine, some lupin, and this is a sticky monkey flower right there. And grasses do well in the sunny areas as well. And on this hillside, I'm seeing mixed in with native ground cover some poppies, and this looks like it might be a possibly a blue ground cover ceanothus, or we actually have lithidora as well. Both are evergreen. So you can see that balance in there. So we talk a lot about either reducing or removing lawn, especially if you're, you don't have enough sun for lawn. It's just a lot of work to try to maintain one, and when really the solution would be something else. But here we see, I love this. I was just on one of my walks. I saw they got rid of their lawn, and this is all woolly thyme here. So if you like that kind of restful massing of that a green lawn gives you, that kind of in a way sets off a lot of surrounding plants, as a mat would do to a painting. There are some ground covers that give you that look. Here in the sun is a beach strawberry. It covers very fast and well. You could also be working with succulents. And here's a case where they, on the right or left, they turned the lawn into a wildflower meadow. This is going to be taller as you walk through it, maybe, at least up to the knees, if not waist. And, and you have to understand that it has seasonally, it's going to go into, it's going to be brown grasses and spent flowers, in the fall or winter. But from a habitat perspective, that's where a lot of insects are in the stems of the old flowers, or protection under those grasses. That's where a lot of hibernation happens. So if you do want to remove, some portion of your lawn, this is a good way to do it. It does take time, as opposed to we've learned that, the spraying with Roundup is bad, and actually rototilling, it disturbs that whole underground microbial community, and it's just not needed. So sheet mulching is a way to remove lawn. Here you can see that piece of the cardboard were laid down. This was a field. We did some preparation before. We cut the grass closely. It had some rain. And we actually, as a Kickstarter, had laid down some cottonseed meal to add some nitrogen to the mix, because we're basically composting here, but not in a separate bin, but just over the ground. We're really matching what happens in the forest all the time, with its annual supply of needles and leaves that drop to the ground and decompose. So we're covering this cardboard pretty quickly with, or thickly, I should say, with fall leaves and a big pile of bark chips and mulch. And this was for the city of Gresham, and they had ample supply of both of these that we used in a large community volunteer project. This is turning a field into a community garden, and I can say that it really worked successfully. But, we put it in the fall, and in this case, we didn't get to it till over a year, but I think just over the winter, were in the fall rains, because moisture is a key component to all of this decomposing and turning into more compost that then brings up all the microbes further down in the ground to this wonderful medium that we're creating. So it's a great way to build healthy soil. So we're doing all, for many reasons, but a big one is because we want to create habitat in our urban and suburban areas. And the more everybody does that, the more connected habitat we have, which is even a compounded value. So we know about, putting in shrubs and that have flowers and berries, and, and sun-loving perennials that will be there for all the pollinators. But it's important to remember that wildlife habitat means food, shelter, and water. So it's essential to have some bird baths for water. Here's a case where it's actually a little mud bath for butterflies. They don't really land in a bird bath. That's a little bit dangerous for them. So, and you can have, several situated around. If it's just a bird bath, you want to be sure to refresh it. And we like to put some stones or things in the bird bath path to create different levels so a honeybee or bumblebee can land, on these little rocks that are in there and lap at the edge of it to get the water, drink the water. Here again is another example of someone that decided to just go meadow for a portion of their yard. And this is in the upper right, Xerxes Society is, you're all familiar with Audubon, and Xerxes is a conservation society, a national organization, or is it international? Not unlike Audubon, but it's for invertebrates, primarily insects. So this is one of their campaigns to leave the leaves in the winter. You can brush them into your beds, and they're good mulch that protects the soil through our winter rains. And as I said, it's just, we have butterflies, beetles, bees, moths, and more. They're all using this as shelter, and probably, and hibernating. A lot of them will probably be in their pupa state through the winter. And then down in the bottom, we see a mason bee house. They are, in nature, they would be looking for cavities to lay their eggs in. And then they build little clay walls between each egg in that cavity with a little food for each of them, and then they'll emerge in the spring as a full-grown bee. And just a few more examples, if you've got lots of rock on your property, as do I, just stacking it creates a lot of nooks and crannies for our native newt and/or snakes. Brush piles are good protection for little birds, especially if there's feral cats in the neighborhood. Here we see a nice it is diversified, hard to see, but a hedgerow, it's both a screen and a shelter, for maybe bird nests. A conifer is really important as protection from the winter rains. But dead woods, snag, or just even logs or stumps on the ground, they're a food source, number one, and they bring birds that feed on the insects and the decaying wood. And here you see is actually a design, if you're really inspired, hibernaculum. This is, it's digging a hole and filling it with maybe rocks. You see old concrete blocks here, logs, and finer debris. And this is an underground place where snakes can hibernate. But maybe the rock pile is good as well. So I talked about circulation, which I think is, I really like it. It's really fun to watch that. Even my cat and dog uses. It's like, hey, they're going to run around, so let's give them, a path to run around in, and they tend to do that. The key is that these are all pervious pathway systems where water can drain on down through into the ground. So we see a pretty finely, neatly installed gravel path. It has still edging to hold that, a nice clean edge on it. This is another type of gravel, a little bit, probably it looks like maybe 1/2-inch river stone, rounder, but it is also edged to hold it in place. There's other areas where you can just go very natural with a wood chip path. This looks like a little wooded corner of a garden, and you don't need nice clean edges for that. You can just lay down that path. Or you do stepper stones like this, so it's a little more, less of a, this would be a not as heavily trafficked area, I guess is what I want to say. Or even in the lawn, you could have some stepper stones. So if you don't want a whole path, but you're going to be walking that. In this, if you can see it, it's bottom second from right. And this is like paving stones laid within a gravel path. Or you could even, I've seen this, like if you have some old concrete, that you need to bust up and remove. You can have broken concrete that we call it, what is it called? Urban It can be used in place of flagstone, which can get kind of pricey, whereas concrete is like it's going to go into the landfill. Let's see if we can use it to make paths as doing a couple of good things at once. And then, you know, a driveway is probably after your roof, the driveway is typically the biggest impervious surface for most homeowners, and just carving out the center of it so that water can drain off the concrete into that center. And here we see, this is a whole combination, kind of a mosaic of succulents and thymes in the middle of the driveway. Of course, that would be for a sunny driveway. Sorry, or thyme. So other landscape features are the rain gardens, which we see on top here, several different styles. Or if you want to harvest rain, you'd be getting a big tank or cistern, more on the order of this size. And this might even overflow into your rain garden if you want it. Swales are another way to convey water. You could disconnect your downspout and have it run as a swell through your garden bed if the grades are right for that. And the bottom left here was a case where this homeowner was receiving a lot of water from the homes around her, and the lawn was always so soggy that it was hard to use. So in this case, there's actually a French drain buried under this little rock swell here that conveys the water to a rain garden in the far corner of the yard. But you can see, you know, they're both a functional and aesthetic feature to help steer the rainfall where it's doing some good for you. And then there's the rain for wildlife. I've talked about the bird bath like this with things in it. Doesn't need to be that full. Or you might just have, now you can go to landscape supply place and get rocks that are cut to become their own little bird bath when it rains. This one with the blue jay photo is, that's actually a planter converted to a bird bath, and it's recirculating. So there is bubbling water, which is a real attraction to the birds, both by sound and playfulness. And so I'm just giving you kind of a selection of what you can do with water, celebrated as a feature. Of course, this becomes quite a feature to actually have cascading water in your yard, but you know, it's very nice to have if your home is your retreat. And, you know, there's a lot of folks that are interested in both naturescaping and edible gardening. And especially if you find that your garden might be in the front, it's really nice to give it some structure, like these boxes that, you know, because gardens go through periods of time where there's not much happening. And so, you know, it's nice to have a raised bed of some sort, and it actually extends the season of growing because you have better drainage and the soil warms up sooner in the spring. Or you can extend into the winter with these hoops and actually have it protected. So you can have kale and chard through the winter. Bottom left, that's just an example of a blueberry shrub, which I think is great for the edibles, and it's a beautiful landscape plant as well. And as we go across here, we can see, you know, people using their fencing for trellising, or here's a separate fence trellis for some blackberries, and we see artichoke and fig in the foreground. So there's a completely edible front yard. And it's just nice. This is an example of you know, a really designed compost system. So you can recycle all those good nutrients from your garden and build some really great black compost to add back into the garden. And I see Andrew is back. I think you're going to take this one.
I'm happy to. Yeah. So there's also just a couple of additional resources that we want to point out for folks. One of those resources is us at the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District. As I mentioned at the top, We do have technicians that are more than happy to come out to your properties if you are in Washington County and provide site-specific advice to you. So in that follow-up email, I'll also include the contact information for our urban conservation specialist. Her name is Brita. You can see her with a camera right in that top photo there. And she would love to come out to any sites and talk about any of your naturescaping projects or ideas that you might have. Even if you're outside of Washington County, as I also mentioned, reach out to your other local soil and water conservation districts, because I'm sure many of them have the same programs that we do. And after those site visits, Brita and any of our conservation specialists are always happy to talk about some financial assistance that we can help provide, because some of these projects can get expensive, which we're trying to make it so finances aren't the issue that is stopping you from taking them on. We want to go over to the next resource, and that is the Backyard Habitat Certification Program. So this is another program that I know Laura had mentioned a couple of times in the presentation. It is specifically built to help urban homeowners and even apartment dwellers, you name it, urban community members, urban gardeners, create backyard habitats within their spaces. And those are spaces big and small, whether that's a backyard, a patio, even within a community space, this program is set up for you. And as you can see with many of the, you can come out, have a site visit with a technician. They can talk also about your goals, help you develop that site plan. And then you can actually apply for certification and have your space become Backyard Habitat certified. And as you can see from that certification criteria, many of those criteria relate directly to so much of the things that we've been talking about today. So naturescaping and backyard habitat absolutely go hand in hand. And I will provide a direct link to their website, and you can learn more and sign up through that follow-up email. And here's our contact information if you do have any additional questions. As I mentioned, you'll also have my email as well. So I'm more than happy to connect you with any questions that you might have along the way. Speaking of questions, I think that is our next stop, isn't it, Laura?
Yeah.
So I do have a couple of questions. I'm going to start with one that was asked in the registration again, because I saved it for this go around. So, but if anyone has any questions, now's a great time to go ahead and put those into that Q&A. So the question that we had earlier was, they're getting ready to build a bird bath fountain, but they're wondering about the best placement. Should they put it in the sun, in the shade? What would your recommendation be?
Good question. I'm glad you asked it. Because I often see bird baths like put in the center of a lawn like it's a sculpture. And that's not, I don't know, maybe some birds will come to that. But what I've found in my own experience is that it's a little bit tucked in, like it's usually within the planting bed and next to, I like to have it next to a tree, a small tree or a large shrub where there's some branches, because they like to flit from the branch down to the bath, back up to the branches. And maybe they just feel safer that way. That there's a little bit of habitat around the bird bath. So that's what I would advise, is that it's tucked in. It doesn't, not deep shade and not too hidden, but also not out in the middle of the open, but right on the edge where it can kind of benefit from both those things. Easy to fly into, but they can fly up into some branches whenever they want.
Awesome. Yeah, a nice partial shade underneath the tree. I love that. That's a nice placement idea. I have a maple in my yard that I'm thinking that might be a good spot for myself to put one in. All right, so questions from today's webinar. So we'll go ahead and start with those, but if anyone has any additional questions, please feel free to go ahead and include those. So this person leaves the leaves in place in their beds throughout the winter and the fall. So if they want to add compost to the bed, what would be the best time to do that so that they don't smother any of the overwintering critters under the leaves?
Oh, another good question. I think I'm going to say later spring, because you want to give everything a chance to sort of wake up and come out of their dormancy period. And that's another reason, which I suspect if you're already putting leaves on the ground, which is a good practice, we always also advise, don't do that cleanup in the fall where you're cutting everything back, especially if you have, those plants or flowering plants with stems and things. And it's just do the cleanup in the spring. Of course, you could with those where you have stalks and stems, maybe you cut them back, but you still have the pile of them, somewhere so they can, you don't want to be as I teach for East Multnomah Soil and Water Conservation District, and there are a couple workshops offered there on beneficials, and the woman who teaches, it's like you've just created this whole hotel for them, and now you're going to take it and stuff it into the green bin. It sounds horrible, So yeah, keep your cleanups in the spring and probably a little, when it's warm enough that activity is happening.
Great advice there. So I had a question. What kind of company can assess the stability of a retaining wall?
I'm kind of wondering, like, a retaining wall can be something that's a couple feet high, a loose, or a dry stone stacked, or it can be a solid concrete, retaining wall that's 5 feet high. And so those are the ones that are more usually that fail because they haven't accounted for water ideally needs to drain through the retaining wall. If it's held behind it, sort of pushes the wall out or it begins to crack and stuff like that. So let's say, would a landscape contractor, actually what I would say, I would call somebody who does build walls would be the best and especially if you're thinking you might need to replace it, that would be reason to call them. If you don't, I still would go with someone who was licensed as a landscape contractor that should have the knowledge. They might, if it's a lot of wall and it's a large high wall, they might kind of bump it up to an engineer, but start simple and see if you can call one of the landscape companies to have a look at it.
Yeah, I think any sort of probably like excavation and grading company might be another good way to think of it, because I know they often deal with a lot of that earth moving. So they might have some good recommendations for you.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks. Yeah, that too.
All right. Another question we got from today. So they're building a front yard patio and they would like to have it with a mixed native privacy screen around it. However, they don't want it to feel or look like a wall. The patio is north, or the yard is north facing. Do you have any great plant combinations that would be interesting to put together?
Well, I'm thinking from what I'm hearing, I usually want to ask about 4 more questions when I get a question.
Of course, that's how it goes.
Yeah, like it's north facing, but does it get sun? And some of the time, do you want it to be evergreen? Or is that not necessary? Maybe it could be mixed. And I'm thinking that as a hedge, like something, especially if you see yourself sitting down, maybe you don't want anything that's any higher than 3 feet high. And so, and if it's north side, I'm thinking of some nice evergreen plants could be the evergreen huckleberry, salal, sword fern. That gets just about 3 feet high. You might want something a little taller. There's an Oregon grape that is about medium height. There's the tall Oregon grape and there's the low Oregon grape. And then there's one that's called creeping Oregon grape. And I'm not sure why, because everyone I know gets about 3 or 4 feet tall. So I happen to like that one. It's got a soft, it's not as leathery and deep green and glossy as say the other two are. It's a little softer leaf and it gets more sort of red sheen color on it with new leaf growth or with fall color. So that might be an option as well. Off the top.
I got it. Sorry to interrupt. I got a couple of answers to your earlier question. So it gets some mornings, or it gets mostly morning sun, gets some afternoon sun, and it is kind of a mixed shade or mixed exposure. And then ideally they liked it to be a little bit taller.
Oh, okay. Yeah. God, when I think of these, it's like, okay, but not 10 or 12 feet taller. But still, you might want to feature a red flowering currant, and it's deciduous. So you're going to see, maybe there's a couple of them that some of it's low and some of it's a little higher, and the deciduous, it's a real feature in the spring when it's all in bloom. Of course, it will drop its leaves in the fall, so you'll just see the structure of it. There's 2 low spireas. So again, they're deciduous, but gosh, they keep their leaves on quite long, and they would be again maybe 4 feet. There's it's Spirea densiflora and Spirea the birch leaf Spirea, which I'm trying to think of its botanic name, but you'll probably remember birch leaf Spirea better anyway. Let's see what else. It's that middle zone can be a little bit tricky. There is snowberry that's deciduous and wants to get maybe 5 feet tall, but could be pruned. Yeah, that middle zone is a little gets to be a little hard because so many of our native deciduous shrubs want to get large. That's why I lean more toward the evergreens that aren't as large for you.
I think those are some great options. And I know I have the birch leaf Spirea at my house, and I actually really, really like it. It's in its it's in its second year now. And it's about 2 foot tall, so it'll get a little bit larger, but it does provide a nice kind of structure throughout my garden bed.
Looking at it's a smallish group there. So I don't think there's any the first ones that I list that are perfect for that use.
And I think you were grabbing the same book that I do, because I know our resources are much the same, and I'll include this in that follow-up email. But both Laura and I are grabbing the same book, which is this Native Plants of the Willamette Valley Yards, and I will include that in the follow-up email because it's, as you saw, it is both of our go-to resources, and it really is fantastic. So I did get another question. What type of evergreens are good for sound barriers? This would be on the north side of a property with afternoon sun on a medium slope.
North facing slope, but gets afternoon sun.
Yep, north side of the property with
right?
afternoon sun. Yep, that's correct.
Well, I did list that one photo that I mentioned. It had it's a visual screen, and truly I haven't tested with decibels, device to see how much sound really cuts, but the denser ones would do the most. And with that, I think the the strawberry tree, it's a relative of the madrone. It's arbutus, is the genus. And I've got a couple of these in my yard that are now 3 years old, and they get to be a pretty good size, up to 10 feet. And they're very solid. The Pacific, what was I thinking of? Some aren't quite as dense. The tall Oregon grape, I think it all depends on how long and big of a hedge you want. The Oregon grape is maybe good up to 6 feet, and not quite as high. And then it's a little bit harder to find, but there is a plant called the silk tassel tree, which is evergreen, and also can be pretty thick, especially if you prune it. All of these are going to get that thicker habit from pruning them, whereas they might be a little more open if you let them be natural. So that's something to keep in mind as well. But those are all, that's for evergreen native plants that make good hedges.
There you go. Awesome. Well, that's all the questions that I've gotten thus far. But if any questions come along after the fact, please feel free just to respond to that follow-up email that I'll send, and I'm more than happy to pass anything along to Laura. And again, as I mentioned, we're always happy to set up a site visit with some of our experts to come out and talk directly about the conditions that you're looking at. Well, I want to thank you again, Laura, for joining us and presenting.
Thank you for hosting.
Oh, absolutely. I always pick up ideas for my garden whenever I hear you speak. So I know I appreciate it personally. So, and I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. I hope this provides a little bit of inspiration as we start to get into garden planting season, which is always that fall, winter time is a nice time to really kind of sit down and think about what you want to use in your space, no matter how big or small that may be.
Yeah. Sheet mulching.
There you go.
Time.
It is certainly time. That's for certain.
Great.
Well, thank you again, everyone. And I hope you all have a great evening.
Good night.